Let's go to Mr. Land, the land of magic. Come on and see Mr. Fields and Mr. Trees, Mr. Birds and Mr. Bees, Mr. See all the Mr. Men, the men who live there. It's Mr.
Book 1, Mr. Tickle.
It really is a pantomime.
It was a warm, sunny morning. In his small house at the other end of the wood, Mr. Tickle was asleep. You didn't know there was such a thing as a tickle, did you? Well, there is. Tickles are small and round, and they have arms that stretch and stretch and stretch. Extraordinary long arms. Mr. Tickle was fast asleep. He was having a dream. It must have been a very funny dream, because it made him laugh out loud, and that woke him up. He sat up in bed, stretched his extraordinary long arms, and yawned an enormous yawn. Mr. Tickle felt hungry, so do you know what he did? He reached out one of his extraordinary long arms, opened the bedroom door, reached down the stairs, opened the kitchen door, reached into the kitchen cupboard, opened a biscuit tin, took out a biscuit, brought it back upstairs, in through the bedroom door, and back to Mr. Tickle in bed. As you can see, it's very useful indeed having arms as long as Mr. Tickle's. Mr. Tickle munched his biscuit. He looked out of the window. Today looks very much like a tickling day, he thought to himself. So, later that morning, after Mr. Tickle had made his bed and cooked his breakfast, he set off through the wood. As he walked along, he kept his eyes very wide open, looking for someone to tickle, looking for anybody to tickle. Eventually, Mr. Tickle came to a school. There was nobody about, so, reaching up his extraordinary long arms to a high window ledge, Mr. Tickle pulled himself up and peeped in through the open window. Inside, he could see a classroom. There were children sitting at their desks, and a teacher writing on the blackboard. Mr. Tickle waited a minute, and then reached in through the window. Mr. Tickle's extraordinary long arm went right up to the teacher, paused, and then tickled! The teacher jumped in the air and turned around very quickly to see who was there. But there was nobody there. Mr. Tickle grinned a mischievous grin. He waited another minute, and then tickled the teacher again. This time, he kept on tickling until the teacher was laughing out loud and saying, "Stop it! Stop it!" over and over again. All the children were laughing too at such a funny sight. There was a terrible pandemonium. Eventually, Mr. Tickle thought that he had enough fun, so he gave the teacher one more tickle for luck, and then very quietly brought his arm back through the open window. Chuckling to himself, he jumped down from the window, leaving the poor teacher to explain what it was all about. Which, of course, he couldn't. Then, Mr. Tickle went to town. And what a day Mr. Tickle had. He tickled the policeman on traffic duty at the crossroads in the middle of town. It caused an enormous traffic jam. He tickled the greengrocer just as he was piling apples neatly in his shop window. The greengrocer fell over backwards, and the apples rolled all over the shop. At the railway station, the guard was about to wave his flag for the train to leave. As he lifted his arm in the air, Mr. Tickle tickled him. And every time he tried to wave his flag, Mr. Tickle tickled him until the train was 10 minutes late leaving the station, and all the passengers were furious. That day, Mr. Tickle tickled everybody. He tickled the doctor. He tickled the butcher. He even tickled old Mr. Stamp, the postman, who dropped all his letters into a puddle. Then Mr. Tickle went home. Sitting in his armchair in his small house at the other side of the wood, he laughed and laughed every time he thought about all the people he had tickled. So, if you are in any way ticklish, Beware of Mr. Tickle and those extraordinary long arms of his. Just think, perhaps he's somewhere about at this very moment while you're reading this book. Perhaps that extraordinary long arm of his is already creeping up to the door of this room. Perhaps it's opening the door now and coming into the room. Perhaps before you know what is happening, you will be well and truly tickled!
Mr. Fields and Mr. Trees, Mr. Birds and Mr. Bees, Mr. Sea, all the Mr. Men, the men who live there. It's Mr.
Book 2, Mr. Greedy.
It really is a pantomime.
Mr. Greedy liked to eat. In fact, Mr. Greedy loved to eat, and the more he ate, the fatter he became. And the trouble was, the fatter he became, the more hungry he became. And the more hungry he became, the more he ate. And the more he ate, the fatter he became, and so it went on. Mr. Greedy lived in a house that looked rather like himself. It was a roly-poly sort of a house. One morning, Mr. Greedy awoke rather earlier than usual. He had been dreaming about food as usual, and that made him wake up feeling hungry as usual. So Mr. Greedy got up, went downstairs, and ate the most enormous breakfast. This is what Mr. Greedy had for his breakfast. Toast 2 slices, cornflakes 1 packet, milk 1 bottle, sugar 1 bowlful, toast 3 slices, eggs 3 boiled, toast 4 slices, butter 1 dish, marmalade 1 pot. When he had finished his enormous breakfast, Mr. Greedy sat back in his chair, smiled a very satisfied smile, and thought.
That was a delicious breakfast,
He thought to himself.
Now, I wonder what would be nice to have for lunch.
He decided in order to work up an appetite for lunch, he would go for a long walk. That morning, Mr. Greedy walked and walked and walked. Then, he discovered a cave.
That's funny,
He thought.
I don't remember seeing that there before.
Mr. Greedy, being a curious sort of fellow, decided to explore. He entered the dark cave. Inside, he discovered some giant steps leading upwards. Mr. Greedy, being a curious sort of fellow, decided to climb them. They were very steep and very difficult to climb, but with much huffing and puffing, Mr. Greedy climbed up and up. At the top of the steps, Mr. Greedy came to a door. It was without doubt the biggest door that Mr. Greedy had ever seen, and it wasn't quite shut. Mr. Greedy, being a curious sort of a fellow, decided to see what was on the other side of that door. So Mr. Greedy squeezed himself through the crack in the door, and there before him was an amazing sight. The biggest room in the world. The door was as big as a field. The table in the middle of the floor was as big as a house, and the chairs around it were as high as trees. Mr. Greedy felt very small. Then he sniffed. Coming from somewhere up on top of that gigantic table was the most delicious foodly smell that Mr. Greedy had ever smelt. Mr. Greedy sniffed again, and then decided that he must get up onto that table. So he began to climb up the leg of the enormous chair. It was very difficult, and it took him a long time, but eventually Mr. Greedy stood on the table. Everything was larger than life. The salt and pepper pots were both as big as pillar boxes. There was a bowl of fruit on the table, and Mr. Greedy tried to lift up one of the oranges. And Mr. Greedy, being Mr. Greedy, took a bite out of one of the apples there. Then he looked around. On the other side of the table stood the source of that delicious smell. A huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal plate. And on the plate, huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal sausages the size of pillows. And huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal potatoes the size of beach balls. And huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal peas the size of cabbages. Mr. Greedy hurried across the table towards the plate, and being Mr. Greedy, began to eat. Suddenly, a shadow fell across the plate, and Mr. Greedy found himself being picked up by a giant hand and looking into the eyes of a real-life giant.
And who,
thundered the giant,
are you?
Mr. Greedy was so frightened that he could only just manage to squeak his voice.
Mr. Greedy!
He squeaked. The giant laughed a laugh as loud as thunder.
Greedy by name and greedy by nature.
He bellowed.
Well, I think, Mr. Greedy, that you need to be taught a lesson.
And what a lesson it was. The giant made Mr. Greedy eat up everything on that huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal plate. When he had finished, Mr. Greedy felt very ill indeed, as if he would burst at any minute.
Now,
said the giant in a much quieter voice.
do you promise never to be greedy again?
Oh, yes!
Groaned Mr. Greedy.
I promise!
Very well,
Said the giant.
then I'll let you go.
Mr. Greedy climbed down from the table and went out through the door, feeling very fat and extremely miserable. And do you know what? From that day to this, Mr. Greedy has kept his promise. And do you know something else as well? Mr. Greedy doesn't look like he used to look anymore. He now looks like this, which I think suits him a lot better, don't you? So, if you know anyone who's as greedy as Mr. Greedy used to be, you know what to tell them, don't you?
Beware of giants.
Mr. Fields and Mr. Trees, Mr. Birds and Mr. Bees, Mr. Sea, all the Mr. Men, the men who live there. It's Mr.
Book 3, Mr. Happy.
It really is a pantomime.
On the other side of the world, where the sun shines hotter than here, and where the trees were 100 feet tall, there is a country called Happy Land. As you may very well expect, everyone who lives in Happy Land is as happy as the day is long. Wherever you go, you see smiling faces all around. It's such a happy place that even the flowers seem to smile in Happy Land. And as well as all the people being happy, all the animals in Happy Land were happy too. If you've never seen a mouse smile, or a cat, or a dog, or even a worm, go to Happy Land. This is a story about someone who lived there who happened to be called Mr. Happy. Mr. Happy was fat and round and happy. He lived in a small cottage beside a lake at the foot of a mountain and close to a wood in Happy Land. One day, while Mr. Happy was out walking through the tall trees in these woods near his home, he came across something which was really rather extraordinary. There, in the trunk of one of the very tall trees, was a door. Not a very large door, but nevertheless a door. Certainly a door. A small, narrow, yellow door. Definitely a door. I wonder who lives here, thought Mr. Happy to himself, and he turned the handle of that small, narrow, yellow door. The door wasn't locked, and it swung open quite easily. Just inside the small, narrow, yellow door was a small, narrow, winding staircase leading downwards. Mr. Happy squeezed his rather large body through the rather thin doorway and began to walk down the stairs. The stairs went round and round and down and down and round and down and down and round. Eventually, after a long time, Mr. Happy reached the bottom of the staircase. He looked around and saw, there in front of him, was another small, narrow door, but this one was red. Mr. Happy knocked at the door. "Who's there?" said a voice, a sad, squeaky sort of a voice. "Who's there?" Mr. Happy pushed open the red door slowly, and there, sitting on a stool, was someone who looked exactly like Mr. Happy, except that he didn't look happy at all. In fact, he looked downright miserable. "Hello," said Mr. Happy. "I'm Mr. Happy." "Oh, are you indeed?" sniffed the person who looked like Mr. Happy but wasn't. "Well, my name is Mr. Miserable, and I'm the most miserable person in the world." "Why are you so miserable?" asked Mr. Happy.
Because I am,
replied Mr. Miserable. "How would you like to be happy like me?" asked Mr. Happy.
I'd give anything to be happy,
said Mr. Miserable.
But I'm so miserable, I don't think I could ever be happy,
he added miserably. Mr. Happy made up his mind quickly. "Follow me," he said.
Where to?
asked Mr. Miserable. "Don't argue," said Mr. Happy, and he went out through the small, narrow red door. Mr. Miserable hesitated, and then followed. Up and up the winding staircase they went, up and round and round and up and round and round and up until they came out into the wood. "Follow me," said Mr. Happy again, and they both set off through the wood back to Mr. Happy's cottage. Mr. Miserable stayed in Mr. Happy's cottage for quite some time, and during that time the most remarkable thing happened. Because he was living in Happyland, Mr. Miserable, ever so slowly, stopped being miserable and started to be happy. His mouth stopped turning down at the corners, and ever so slowly, it started turning up at the corners. And eventually, Mr. Miserable did something that he never done in the whole of his life. He smiled, and then he chuckled, which turned into a giggle, which became a laugh. A big, booming, hearty, huge, giant, large, enormous laugh. And Mr. Happy was so surprised that he started to laugh as well. And both of them laughed and laughed. They laughed until their sides hurt and their eyes watered. Mr. Miserable and Mr. Happy laughed and laughed and laughed and laughed. They went outside and still they laughed. And because they were laughing so much, everyone who saw them started laughing as well. Even the birds in the trees started to laugh at the thought of somebody called Mr. Miserable who just couldn't stop laughing. And that's really the end of the story. Except to say that if you ever feel as miserable as Mr. Miserable used to, you know exactly what to do, don't you? Just turn your mouth up at the corners. Go on!
Mr. Fields and Mr. Trees, Mr. Birds and Mr. Bees, Mr. Sea, all the Mr. Men, the men who live there. It's Mr.
Book 4, Mr. Nosey.
It really is a pantomime.
Mr. Nosey liked to know about everything that was going on. He was always poking his nose into other people's business. Mr. Nosey was the sort of fellow who, if he came upon a locked door, couldn't resist looking through the keyhole to see why the door had been locked. Mr. Nosey was the sort of person who, if he found an unopened letter addressed to somebody else, would simply have to open it to find out what was inside. Mr. Nosey was the sort of person who, if he was sitting reading his paper on a train, would much rather read the paper of the person sitting next to him. Naturally, as you might well imagine, Mr. Nosey was not very popular. People did not like the way in which Mr. Nosey would peek and pry into their affairs. They did not like it at all. But did that stop Mr. Nosey peeking and prying? It did not. Mr. Nosey lived in a funny, tall, thin house in a place called Tiddletown. The people of Tiddletown decided that Mr. Nosey was becoming much too nosy, and so they held a meeting to discuss what to do about him.
We must find some way of stopping him being so nosy,
said old Mr. Chips, the town carpenter. That's right, said Mrs. Washer, who ran the Tiddletown laundry. He needs to be taught a lesson.
If only we could think of a way to stop him poking his nose into everything,
said Mr. Brush, the painter. And then a small smile spread over his face. Listen, he said, now grinning. I have a plan. All his friends gathered round to listen to his plan. The following morning, Mr. Nosey was out walking along Tiddletown High Street when he heard somebody whistling behind one of the closed doors.
I wonder what's going on here,
he thought to himself, and, tiptoeing up to the door, he quietly opened it and peered in. Splash! Went a very wet paintbrush right on the end of Mr. Nosey's nose, covering it with bright red paint. "Oh dear, I am sorry," said Mr. Brush, who was painting the inside of the door. Poor Mr. Nosey had to go straight home to try and remove the red paint, which was very difficult and rather painful. Mr. Brush chuckled to himself. The plan had begun. The following day, Mr. Nosey was out walking past the laundry when he heard somebody laughing on the other side of the wall.
I wonder what's going on here.
He thought to himself, and standing on tiptoe, he looked over the wall. Snap! Went a clothes peg right on the end of Mr. Nosey's nose. "Oh dear, I am sorry," said Mrs. Washer, who was hanging up clothes on a washing line on the other side of the wall. Poor Mr. Nosey removed the clothes peg and went off down the street, feeling extremely sorry for himself and for his poor red nose. Mrs. Washer chuckled to herself. The plan was working. The next day, Mr. Nosey was going past a fence when he heard hammering.
I wonder what's going on here.
He thought to himself, and creeping very quietly to the end of the fence, he peeped round. Bang! Went a hammer right on the end of Mr. Nosey's nose. "Oh dear, I am sorry," said old Mr. Chips, who was nailing up a loose plank on the fence. Poor Mr. Nosey had to go home immediately and bandage his poor, red, sore nose. Mr. Chips grinned a broad grin. The plan was working very well indeed. The following day, Mr. Nosey was walking in the woods when he heard somebody sawing wood.
I wonder what's going on here.
He thought to himself, and he crept up behind a tree. He was just about to peer out from behind the tree when it suddenly occurred to him that if he did, something very nasty might happen to his nose. And so he went on his way without being nosy. Behind the tree, with a saw raised in his hand, stood Mr. Herd the farmer. When he saw that Mr. Nosey had gone in his way without being nosy, he laughed and laughed and laughed. The plan had worked. Mr. Herd hurried into Tiddletown to tell everybody. The plan really had worked, because after that, Mr. Nosey stopped being nosy and soon became very good friends with everybody in Tiddletown. And that is the end of the story, except to say that if you are ever tempted to be as nosy as Mr. Nosey used to be, you'd better expect one thing: a sore nose.
Mr. Fields and Mr. Trees, Mr. Birds and Mr. Bees, Mr. Sea, all the Mr. Men, the men who live there. It's Mr.
Book 5, Mr. Sneeze.
It really is a pantomime.
This is Coldland, which is a country somewhere near the North Pole. The weather in Coldland is winter all the time. When it isn't snowing, it's freezing, and when it isn't freezing, it's snowing. So you can imagine how cold it is. Because it's so cold in Coldland, everybody who lives there is cold as well. You can tell if somebody comes from Coldland because everybody there has a red nose, and people in Coldland aren't the only ones with red noses. In Coldland, you can see red-nosed dogs chasing red-nosed cats, chasing red-nosed mice. In Coldland, you can even see red-nosed elephants. And what you hear most of the time in Coldland is a noise that sounds like this. Achoo! The sound of the sneeze is very common indeed in Coldland, which isn't very surprising, is it? This is the story of Mr. Sneeze, who lived in a small snow-covered cottage in Shivertown, the capital of Coldland. Every morning, Mr. Sneeze woke up, sneezed, got up, sneezed, got dressed, sneezed, went downstairs, sneezed, ate his breakfast, sneezed, and went to work, still sneezing. I don't like this sneezing all the time, he thought to himself every day, until one day he decided to leave Coldland and try to find a cure for the sneezes. So that very same day, Mr. Sneeze packed the things he needed for his journey, mainly handkerchiefs, sneezed, locked his front door, sneezed, and set off. He walked and sneezed and walked his way across Cold Land, and he sneezed and walked and sneezed for days and days until Cold Land was far behind. As he walked away from Cold Land, he noticed that there was less and less snow, and eventually he walked so far that there was no snow at all, and as he walked, he noticed something else. He wasn't walking and sneezing, he was walking and walking. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sneezing. Not at all. Not a bit. Not even the tiniest tissue.
I wonder why I'm not sneezing,
he thought to himself. But he must have thought his thought out loud to himself, because a voice behind him replied,
You're not sneezing because you haven't got a cold.
Mr. Sneeze jumped, turned, and there behind him stood a wise old wizard.
What's a cold?
Asked Mr. Sneeze.
A cold is what you catch when you're too cold,
said the wise old wizard, wisely.
Oh,
said Mr. Sneeze.
But I come from a country called Cold Land, where everybody is too cold all the time. Nonsense, snorted the wizard. It can't be too cold all the time because of the sun.
And he pointed to the sun, which was smiling in the sky.
But we don't have any sun in Cold Land, said Mr. Sneeze.
No sun!
Exclaimed the wizard. How extremely extraordinary. We better do something about that then, hadn't we?
Yes, agreed Mr. Sneeze, not quite knowing what the wizard was talking about.
How far away is this place called Cold Land? Asked the wizard.
Oh, it's miles and miles and miles away, replied Mr. Sneeze.
In which direction?
Asked the wizard. Mr. Sneeze pointed.
Shouldn't take long, said the wizard,
who then waved his wand and muttered some magic words, which wouldn't be magic if we told you what they were. Whatever those magic words were, they worked. Before you could say sneeze, both the wizard and Mr. Sneeze were transported to Shivertown, which you will remember is the capital of Cold Land. As usual, it was snowing.
I say, this is a cold, gloomy place, said the wizard.
A tissue!
replied Mr. Sneeze, who had started sneezing again.
Cold Land certainly needs some sunshine, said the wizard, and that's going to take some rather special magic.
Please hurry up, said Mr. Sneeze, who was rapidly turning into a snowman.
Now, said the wizard, ignoring him, I'm going to say some magic words, and I want you to sneeze 3 times immediately afterwards.
The wise old wizard then held up his magic wand and muttered some more magic words, which again wouldn't be magic if we told you what they were.
A tissue! A tissue! A tissue!
Sneezed Mr. Sneeze. Then quite suddenly, as if by magic, which indeed it was, the sun came out from behind the big black clouds, and it stopped snowing.
There now, said the wizard. That should stop the sneezing.
And then, after muttering some more magic words, and without waiting even to say goodbye, he disappeared. Mr. Sneeze just stood there in the sunshine, watching the snow begin to melt. After that, the sun shone every day, and today Cold Land isn't anything like it used to be. You can't see red-nosed dogs chasing red-nosed cats chasing red-nosed mice anymore. And these days, the sound of a sneeze is a very uncommon sound indeed. And even Mr. Sneeze doesn't sneeze anymore. And that isn't the only thing different about Mr. Sneeze, as he discovered himself when he looked in the mirror one morning. Can you see what was different about Mr. Sneeze? It happened one other time too. See if you can find the page where that was.
Mr. Fields and Mr. Trees, Mr. Birds and Mr. Bees, Mr. See all the Mr. Men, the men who live there. It's Mr.
Book 6, Mr. Bump.
It really is a pantomime.
this is the sad story of Mr. Bump. The trouble was that Mr. Bump just could not help having little accidents. If there was something for Mr. Bump to bump into, he'd bump into it all right. For instance, if you were to see Mr. Bump out walking down the street in your town, and if there happened to be something to bump into down that street, then you know what would happen, don't you? Bump. Mr. Bump was just the same at home. He lived in an extremely nice home, but even there he couldn't help having those little accidents. For instance, one morning when Mr. Bump went outside his house, he noticed that the chimney pot had come loose in a storm the night before.
"I must fix that before it falls off,"
thought Mr. Bump to himself, and he hurried to his garden shed to fetch a ladder. It was a very long ladder. Mr. Bump walked up the garden path with the ladder on his shoulder. He turned the corner of the garden path. Crash! Went the living room window.
"Oh dear,"
thought Mr. Bump, and he turned to see what had happened. Crash went the kitchen window behind him.
"Oh dear,"
thought Mr. Bump again, and he rested the ladder against the wall of the house so that he could climb up onto the roof to mend the chimney pot. Crash went the bedroom window. So you can see how Mr. Bump had his little accidents. Mr. Bump had had many jobs, but somehow they never seemed to last very long. As soon as anything got lost, or broken, or splintered, or chipped, or snapped, or cracked, or torn, or bust, or wrenched, or crunched, or split, or slit, Mr. Bump got the blame. For instance, when Mr. Bump worked on a farm, he tripped over the farm dog and spilt the milk which he was carrying for the farmer's wife, and which the farm cat lapped up. For instance, when Mr. Bump was a postman, he got his hand stuck in a pillar box, and they had to fetch the fire brigade to come and set him free. For instance, when Mr. Bump was a bus conductor, he fell off the bus and couldn't catch it up again, and all the passengers travelled without having to pay. For instance, when Mr. Bump was a carpenter, he found that when he was hammering nails, he hammered his thumb most of the time, and the nail hardly at all. In order to recover from this series of rather unfortunate happenings, Mr. Bump decided to take a holiday. There, he could think about what sort of job he could do where he wouldn't be such a nuisance to everybody. So off he set to the station to catch a train to the seaside. While Mr. Bump was on holiday, several things happened. For instance, he fell off a boat into the sea, and the lifeboat had to come and rescue him. For instance, one day when he was quietly walking along the beach minding his own business, he got his foot stuck in a bucket, and as he couldn't get it off, he had to walk around with it on his foot for hours. For instance, another time he was walking along the beach. When he walked straight into a large hole that somebody had dug, he had to stay there all night because he couldn't climb out on his own. However, despite all these little accidents, Mr. Bump enjoyed his holiday, and while he was there, he had a splendid idea about what sort of job he could do. It was quite the best idea Mr. Bump had ever had. An absolutely splendid idea. And now, Mr. Bump works happily for Mr. Barley the farmer. Mr. Barley has a rather large apple orchard on his farm, and that's where Mr. Bump works. Mr. Bump's job is picking apples, but he doesn't use a ladder to climb up the tree to pick the apples like other apple pickers. Oh no. Mr. Bump has a much better way of picking apples than that. He just walks about. And before long, Mr. Bump, being Mr. Bump, walks into a tree. Bump! And down falls an apple. And Mr. Bump catches it. This makes the job of apple picking much easier. And Mr. Bump is very pleased about his new job. And Mr. Barley is very pleased about his new apple picker. So you see, the story of Mr. Bump isn't such a sad story after all. And if you ever bump yourself, you know what to do, don't you? Go and eat an apple picked by Mr. Bump, and then you won't feel your bump at all. You'll remember that the next time you have a bump, won't you? Good.
Mr. Fields and Mr. Trees, Mr. Birds and Mr. Bees, Mr. Sea, all the Mr. Men, the men who live there. It's Mr.
Book 7. Mr. Snow.
It really is a Thomas.
One night, 2 days before Christmas, it started to snow. All night it snowed and snowed and snowed and snowed and snowed. Millions and billions of trillions of big white soft snowflakes covered the whole wide world. When morning came, it was quite amazing to see just how much snow had fallen. All the houses, all the trees, all the roads, and all the fields were covered. It was almost as if a huge white blanket had been gently laid over everything. Everywhere you looked was white. And then the sun came out, and so did the children. They were all dressed up and muffled up, wearing scarves and woolies and gloves and boots so that they wouldn't catch cold. All the children were so excited to see so much snow, which isn't surprising really because there was more snow than they ever seen before. Some of them went on their sledges racing down the hills. Some of them, who didn't have sledges, threw snowballs at each other. One little boy even made a snowball that was as big as himself. And some of the children made snowmen. Then it was Christmas Eve. The children all went home early so that they could go to bed early, so that they could get up early to see what Father Christmas had bought them. But that particular Christmas Eve, Father Christmas was in trouble. And the trouble was with that it had snowed so much that Father Christmas was stuck. Well and truly stuck. There was so much snow that his reindeer simply couldn't pull his sleigh piles high with all the presents that he had to deliver to all the children.
Oh dear, thought Father Christmas to himself. Oh dear me, what am I to do?
He sat down on his sack of toys and thought how he could manage to deliver all the presents to all the children before they woke up on Christmas morning.
Oh dear me,
he said out loud and sighed. Now, it just so happened that Father Christmas had got himself stuck just beside a snowman which one of the children had built, and that gave him an idea. A good idea. A very good idea. A very good idea indeed.
How would you like to help me?
He asked the snowman. But of course the snowman didn't answer because snowmen can't talk, can they?
Of course, I'll have to use some of my magic to bring him to life,
thought Father Christmas to himself. So he tugged his white beard 3 times and muttered some Father Christmassy magic words into it. Suddenly, you might almost say magically, the snowman did come to life. "Hello, Father Christmas," said Mr. Snow, which was the snowman's name. "You look a bit sort of stuck if you ask me, which you aren't, and I say so anyway, and if you ask me again, I say you need a sort of helping hand, if you know what I mean, which you probably do, because that's probably why you brought me to life, which you certainly did. So, can I be of any assistance?" Mr. Snow, as you might have gathered, was a rather talkative sort of a snowman.
"Exactly," beamed Father Christmas. "Let's get started."
And start they did. Mr. Snow gave Father Christmas an enormous push, and off they went. They divided the work between them. It was Mr. Snow's job to make sure that all the right toys for all the right boys, and all the right toys for all the right girls were put into all the right sacks. It was Father Christmas's job to make sure he took all the right sacks down all the right chimneys and delivered all the right toys to all the right boys and all the right toys to all the right girls. Mr. Snow and Father Christmas made sure that Susan got her teddy bear. Mr. Snow and Father Christmas made sure that Peter got his train. Mr. Snow and Father Christmas made sure that John got his piggy bank. Mr. Snow and Father Christmas even made sure that little Jane got her squeaky pink elephant to play with in the bath. And then, all of a sudden, they discovered that between them, they'd finish.
"I'd like to thank you very much indeed for helping me deliver all the right toys to all the right boys,"
said Father Christmas, shaking Mr. Snow by the hand. "Not for getting all the right toys to all the right girls," replied Mr. Snow, shaking Father Christmas by the hand.
And now I'd better turn you back into a snowman again, said Father Christmas. Thank you again, and goodbye.
My pleasure, smiled Mr. Snow. And you know, from that Christmas to this Christmas, Father Christmas always chooses a snowman to help him. So, the next time you build a snowman, you better make sure you build him properly, because somebody you know might want that snowman to give him a hand. And you know who that would be, don't you?